Cool. It's a pleasure to be the first speaker in this session, and I'm going to be followed up with Adele, who we're both speaking on the topic of wellness. And it's timely what I'm talking about. It's about New Zealand paramedics using counselling. And in 2 weeks ago, I got to go to Melbourne to see the release of the Beyond Blue First Responder Mental Health Survey, which is the largest of its kind in the world. They interviewed 20,000 first responders in Australia, of fire, police, ambulance, and their state emergency services. And the findings are kind of disturbing, but they give us a benchmark for improving in this area. So I'll touch on a little bit of those findings just so we're on the same page, because it's the most current research available and really significant. And then look at how we can best use counselling, because it's one of the main support services offered to paramedics and to other health professionals that will be in the room. Most of you will have a work-provided EAP. And the research I've done with paramedics is qualitative research looking at their experiences of actually using this EAP. And when I was a new paramedic, about 22 years old, I used the EAP as part of a paper I was doing on professional supervision, and I didn't really think I needed it, and it was really, really helpful. And now I lecture paramedics about mental health and well-being, and students would ask me about what it's like to use these services, when to use them, and I didn't really know how to give them guidance because there's not any literature around what it's like to be a paramedic using these services. But in ambulance services around the world, it's the main way that they're supported is through a counselling service through an EAP. So I'll talk about some of the findings from those paramedics and some encouraging factors that we can use to try and best use those services. So for the Answering the Call survey, just quickly to look at those statistics. So 20,000 first responders. They found 1 in 3 employees have high or very high levels of psychological distress. And in Australia, that's compared to 1 in 8 in the general population. More than 1 in 2.5 employees had been diagnosed with a mental health condition, compared to 1 in 5 adults in Australia. Over 2 times higher than the general population to have suicidal thoughts, and a higher rate around a suicidal plan. And from this, so the stage 3 is around putting strategies in place to improve these statistics. There's these 4 pillars of what a resilient worker looks like. And it's relevant because I'm talking about how we can better use psychological support services. And one of their recommendations is that a resilient worker in healthcare or in particular emergency work will participate in and use available supports. So that's really important as a general part of our practice of being a resilient worker. It's something we're regularly engaging in, and we normalise that behaviour as part of being a resilient worker, not as something we use as a last resort when all of a sudden we're not coping, but actually as an ongoing part of our wellness. So I did a qualitative, interpretive, descriptive study which involves interviews and is a qualitative methodology that allows the researcher to use their clinical knowledge to make changes to practice and changes to policy. So the first thing I found, and it wasn't really surprising because I think I knew this already from being a paramedic, is that paramedics are really good at appearing calm. And I did some work recently with comm staff, and they're much the same. I went and watched them at work, and they all look really calm. And we're really good at being there in crisis, knowing what to do, but not so good at self-reflecting and knowing when we're stressed and where we need help. And from this, a main theme that it was hard to know when to go and use these services. And the paramedics I interviewed, most of them were really senior paramedics, some intensive care paramedics, and when they went to counselling, it was usually at a significant breaking point. This is an example of one of the intensive care paramedics that use counselling, and this was the kind of scenario that they were in. So it's highly reactive and quite disturbing that a clinician that's really experienced has waited for this point in order to use counselling. When I've heard anecdotally from people who outside of paramedicine talk about going to therapy as part of their glamorous life. They might go to the day spa in the morning and go to their therapist in the afternoon. Whereas someone who's dealing with regular trauma, an intensive care paramedic, has waited for them to be having nightmares, sleep problems, and really not been able to go on and function and do their job. So really reactive, because it's hard to know when to go and actually put up your hand and ask for help. When most of the paramedics that went to counselling did go, they actually found it really beneficial. And some had worked for up to 15 years before actually trying counselling, and when they went, it actually wasn't so bad. And even in experiences that weren't that helpful, at the very least, it was quite cathartic. It was nice to talk to people. It was actually good to offload and vent about maybe who we're working with or issues at home, and it generally was a good, beneficial experience. Around that threshold of what might cause you to get counselling or when you should, there was a thought that maybe it was we wait for bad jobs, but we're actually really good at doing our job. So we'd go to really bad jobs and continue to go back to work. So it was examples like the nightmares or when things weren't going well at home that often we eventually went and got help. And if it was related to a bad job and we went and sought counselling, the bad job was sometimes unexpected. For one participant, they went because a patient who had died had the same bedspread as her parents, and that really threw her. And it seems that there's a bit of a glass wall we have up with dealing with stuff, and sometimes those little things can penetrate that glass and shatter it. So this kind of idea of, oh, I'll be fine. If I go to something really bad, I might go and use counselling. It didn't really seem to work and didn't actually eventuate for those paramedics that engaged with those services. And when paramedics did decide to use counselling and access it, small barriers had big implications. And part of the reason for that is that paramedics often go when they're really stressed and they have fallen apart. So using services that are complex or hard to use is a hard thing to do. And one way around this is to user test the services. A number of the participants, particularly in Wellington, found that finding the username and password to get into the counselling system was a significant barrier to access. And when I was thinking about the study, I was thinking about all these big stigmas and different things that would be a barrier, but literally finding a password was a big barrier because people didn't want to ask their manager or ask their peers for what those passwords are. And I know St John, at the moment, some of their managers have been encouraged to use the counselling service, which is a really great thing, because if by user testing those services, we can actually see how some of these challenges and anticipate them. Because it's really easy to say, hey, go and use that, just log on the website. But if you've never used it yourself, it's really hard to actually give good advice. Participants that lived in more rural areas, there's some examples where it was harder to access counselling. Maybe they knew the counsellor, or there's more of a likelihood they might bump into someone that they do know. So that's just some food for thought around maybe access to telehealth services and just thinking about that barrier as well. And a big barrier, which is not surprising, was around stigma. And this quote sums it up quite well. You've got to be pretty crook or maybe a bit nuts to need it. And what's interesting about this quote is that most of the participants actually perpetuated the stigma that they feared because they went when they were pretty crook and maybe a little bit nuts in their language. So this was their fear, and they waited because of this fear, and then went because they felt like they couldn't go to work. So in order to break this cycle of stigma, we need to talk about it more, but go more proactively and use these services. So we can have normal language and just say, oh, I just went for a checkup. I do that 3 or 4 times a year. It's part of my practice to do that. So really important that to break that stigma, the only way we can do that, and managers using those services is a great start to break that stigma. Because if we know someone's been, we can actually have that conversation. If we're not sure they've been or not, we're not going to bring it up because we might be worried about them judging us for our actions. And there's definitely a conspiracy of silence. Most of the stigma was around silence. So some of the more senior staff I talked to were afraid of actually being stigmatized by the newer staff because they said, they assume we know how to cope. And the newer staff said, oh, I wouldn't say because they don't use the service. So often the 2 paramedics might be working together, having both used something like counselling, but are both afraid to talk about it because there's this assumption, this conspiracy of silence that both of them haven't used it, or that they might be weak to have used it. So how can we better utilise counselling to support our colleagues? So going to counselling is the first step. It's really simple. So if you go, you can have an experience, and if your experience is not so good, and you've been when you're well, and you're using it in a proactive way, you can then find a different counsellor that suits you better. And it would be great if we can have conversations about our experiences of going. So you can say, oh, I went to that person and they're not so good. I actually thought they were terrible, but there's this person who actually works at this place who's fantastic, and I've seen them 5 or 6 times. So if a new person was being inducted into your organisation and they could have conversations like that in the hospital on the ambulance, it would be really helpful. Because if paramedics in particular have bad experiences in their first time going, often they'll think, oh, it's rubbish, I don't want to go. But if they can actually have conversations about these experiences, they're more likely to have a beneficial experience. And if we talk about it, we can learn more about where it's not working. And that's really hard working in a university teaching about mental health, because people don't talk about this stuff. It's really hard to give advice because everyone might be having a terrible experience, but no one's talking about it. So if it's not so good, that's really, really helpful to know as well. Leading by example is really an important way. So if you're a manager and you've used a service, tell your staff about it, because it really does help. And encouragement is really, really effective. And staff might have gone, say, 5 years ago, and when they're talking in their interview about their experience of using counselling, often they would lead in with saying, oh, I went because my manager told me to go. I went because my partner told me to go, because I was being really shitty at home, or whatever it was. It was really helpful, it seemed, for them to use that encouragement to take away some of that stigma, rather than say, oh, I had to put my hand up. So if you're managing staff and you're having one-on-one meetings with them, if you encourage them to use those services, it's actually helpful, and it takes away some of that burden of having to put their hand up and ask for help. And to finish, just to reiterate, with participating in these services, is that proactive use is the key thing. And in some other ambulance services, and at St. John are moving that way with a push for more proactive use, because if everybody has used counselling, say, in their first year of working for an ambulance service or an organisation, then everybody can talk about it because we've all had the same experience. Or if a lot of the staff have actually used the service, or a lot of the managers, we can start having conversations about how we can better do this and better look after ourselves. So give counselling a go, because it's one of the main services offered for support, and have conversations about it. I'd be really interested in what your experiences are. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ari. Does anyone have any questions for Ari? We've got a few minutes. Just open up to the floor.
I've got a question. So working both in ambulance and in a DHB, I've noticed a fundamental difference over the last 10 years, where ambulance is now taking a much more proactive approach to this, and people are being encouraged to prospectively go in the same way that you would go to your GP for screening for breast cancer screening or cervical cancer screening, or I'm now old enough to have prostate cancer screening. And you go not because you've got a problem, you're going to prevent a problem. And 5 years ago, we weren't talking about that in ambulance at all, but we're now regularly talking about it. That actually, in the same way that you would go to your GP prospectively, you should be going to some form of counselling prospectively. Should, not must, it's always a personal choice. But I don't know about the rest of you, but in the DHB that I work in, that's not talked about at all, ever, in my experience. And I think the DHBs are quite a long way behind the emergency services in this area.
Do they have a similar...
I guess that's more of a comment than a question.
Right. Do they have a similar access to service? The same?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely they do. But it's not promoted in the same way that in the emergency services we are promoting it.
Cool. So that's a great... So if whatever organisation you work in, at the very least, have a look at what is on offer and what's available, because a lot of staff, some staff don't realise, or they might not even work in healthcare, they might work at a bank or something, and they didn't even realise that they could get this service. So actually see what's provided for you. It's funded by your employer. It's a really good start. And have a look at, and the websites, once you access external agencies, you can choose your counsellor and actually have a look. And part of that proactive use is that if you go early, you can choose who you want to go to with the qualifications you want, rather than ringing a number and just having to see someone tomorrow. You can book someone in 2 weeks' time in an area you want to go to, someone that really appeals to you, and use it like that. Yeah.
Do you think people are potentially scared to go proactively though, because there's this thing out there that you've only got limited access, you can only have so many sessions at a time, and all that kind of stuff? Do you think, did that come across in any of your interviews, that maybe that would have stopped people from going proactively? You know, because if you're limited, do you go and try and stop something before it happens, or do you wait until it happens and then try and fix it afterwards?
I think that's a reasonable point, but people are so reactive in their use that that would be a really great problem to have occurred, but it didn't, because people may have gone after 10 years of working and only used 2 or 3 sessions. And the sessions become a barrier where people misinterpret that and have finally gone and then think, oh, 3's clearly going to be enough because that's but actually that's just a starting point. And so for long-term therapeutic benefit, session limits are a barrier. But because we do use it so reactively, people are waiting 5 or 6 years with no sessions. So it would be great if that was, people were being proactive and we're having conversations about, hey, maybe we need more than 3 per year or what have you. But it's a barrier once people go to, it can be a barrier because some people thought it was 3 sessions and then you get an extra 2, and then someone else, it's quite difficult to decipher. So, yeah.
How much the barrier is the problem in the pot scenario where people don't realise that they need help until it is to the nightmare stage?
I think that sums it up, the frog in the pot. So we are so good at doing our job, and that's with mentioning around the bad jobs. We think, oh, something terrible will really throw us, and we go to that terrible call, and we actually do okay. But it's that accumulation, and that, and then trying to decide when to put your hand up is really hard. So that's where a lot of people with that encouragement, it was helpful because someone said, hey, you should go. So that was the catalyst, because a number of examples were they went to the counsellor because they couldn't go to their shift and they didn't know what else to do. And that really had boiled over. So that's a big thing, and that's why a solution or to proactively use it will actually make us realise that we're half boiled and we might need a little bit of time off or need something. Or if it's a new grad, they can go to a counsellor and actually work out a plan to manage stress throughout their career so that they don't get to that crux point. Yeah?
Do you think there's any value in something less formal, but maybe with an easier entry that could be a helpful stepping stone?
Yeah, I would think like clinical supervision, which could be with a professional peer to take you through ongoing checkups. So it might be your mentor that meets up with a group of new grads, or a group of paramedics get together and talk about calls they've been to. I think that would be really great. And probably more user-friendly than counselling. So if there was going to be a more mandatory approach, clinical supervision would be great because a number of professions have that. The counsellors you go to have to meet with the supervisor and talk about their job in order to be registered. So I think, yes, clinical supervision would be much probably user-friendly approach long term. Yeah, cool.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.